received two strong messages from the king of Assyria through his messengers, suggesting very forcibly, or at least convincingly, that Judah should surrender to Assyria if it knows what's good for it. We'll pick up the story from there. Hi, I'm Ken Godevinus once again, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Today we're studying 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 14 to 24. So what does Hezekiah do this time? Well, verse 14 tells us that he takes the letter from the messengers, he reads it, and he goes up to the house of the Lord and spreads it out before God. And then he prays to God. He gives him credit for who he is, that is, who God is, and then he asks God to listen or see what the king of Assyria has done, and how he has devastated nations and their lands and cast into their fires their worthless gods. Hezekiah tells God, this is the enemy that we want to be delivered from, Lord. And Hezekiah asks God to do this. Why? So that the earth may know that he alone is God. Well, verse 20 tells us that Isaiah again sends word to Hezekiah, saying that God said, because you have prayed to me, I have heard you. Isn't it amazing how Hezekiah goes and does all this by himself, and yet God sends word through Isaiah the prophet, not with Hezekiah at this time, but he sends word through Isaiah that because you have prayed to me, I have heard you. And Isaiah then goes on to say what else God said, specifically as it pertains to Assyria. In verse 21, as if God was speaking, or God was speaking, but Isaiah is saying what God is saying. God refers to Zion or Jerusalem, depicting her here as a young, vulnerable daughter whose purity is being threatened by the would-be Assyrian rapist. The personification hits at the reality which the young girls of the city would face if the Assyrians were to conquer it. Jerusalem is shaking her head after Assyria. That was a mocking gesture of disparagement. Well, then God tells Assyria that she has taunted and hurled insults at the very Holy One of Israel, that is, himself. You've gone too far. He also refers to himself as the sovereign master, the sovereign king who rules over his covenant people and exercises moral authority over them. In verses 23 and 24, God primarily repeats what the Assyrian king has boasted he has done. But in verse 25, God says, but haven't you heard? Or, put another way, surely you have heard how long ago before all that you did, I, God, had it all planned out, and now it's about to come to pass. And he goes on, he says, here's the plan. As a teaser, he says, fortified cities will crash into heaps of ruins. Well, before we look closer at the plan, next time we'll stop right here and dig a little further on this passage. We don't know if God's message and comments about Assyria ever got to the messengers representing Assyria's king or even to the king himself. But sometimes God addresses the enemy more for the sake of his people. What he has to say to the enemy, he wants his people, he wants us to hear, more than for the sake of the enemy himself. This may well have been the case here. Let me close by returning briefly to what Hezekiah did when he got the second set of messages from the king of Assyria's agents. Let's review. He receives and reads the message concerning the news that the king of Assyria had for him, or the warning rather, and he lays it out before God, even though God was fully aware of it. Then he prays to God, giving him credit for who he is, and then he asks God what he wants, to be delivered from this enemy. And note the reason, so that the earth may know that he alone is God. Friends, what bad news have you received today or lately? A lawsuit, a false charge, loss of a job, a broken relationship, a bad diagnosis, bad news on a world scene, what's going on between countries, potential wars, fears, whatever it is, this formula, as outlined here by what Hezekiah did, works. I can attest to that. Give it a shot and see what happens in your life. Then share it with us and others. And next time, we'll see more about God's plan for Assyria and Judah. In the meantime, please, if you like what you're seeing or hearing, please indicate so on the video you're watching. If you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems, please do so. But above all, as I always say when I end these short videos, short studies, keep on studying God's Word.